Okay. So this is the first installment of the end-to-end demonstration that we're going to run through. You can see by this flow diagram, for want of a better word, that what we're going to be actually doing is showing the Portfolio Manager product, feeding into Lifecycle Manager, going through the workflow there, feeding into a dev instance of Policy Manager. And once that workflow flows through, then having it push out and promote into a test instance of Policy Manager. And you'll see that automatic promotion happen, so that the virtual service, anything associated with a virtual service like policies, physical service contracts, everything will come across and be placed into the same organization structure in the test Policy Manager. But what we're also going to be doing is, in those Policy Managers, is showing off the fact that you could have automatic attachment of different policies in different environments. So, for instance, what we'll see is that there'll be a detailed audit policy attached in dev, but only an error audit policy attached in test without even touching anything. And once it's promoted over into test, we'll just run the same application and it will work without doing anything. So it shows the power of setting environments up once and having category matches and mappings to do everything. So we'll go through that as well, but that'll be in the second stage of the demonstration, the second part of the demonstration. So the first part's principally about what happens around planning governance, what happens about design time / development governance, and pushing it out into the first instance of Policy Manager. Now, there needs to be a discussion around the differentiation between Portfolio Manager and Lifecycle Manager. While Portfolio Manager has a dynamic or a process facet of looking after planning within the organisation, that is, the identification, analysis, then decision-making, whether an asset will go forward and be built. And an asset could be a service, it could be a schema, and it could be a policy. Out of the box is basically a service and nothing else, but you could add those other things in there. And then you prioritise it. That is, you say, okay, based on the needs within the enterprise, based on the needs within business, and our strategy, these assets are going to be off the first cab off the rank next, and so on and so forth. And then finally, once it's allocated, that is, well, there's a project come up that meets all the criteria for that asset, and it's now going to be built in that project. You'll see the asset move across in this instance, in this demonstration. It'll be a service, move across and be pushed and appear into Lifecycle Manager. So it starts its build workflow. So, but having said that, or actually moving forward a little bit, in Lifecycle Manager, then it looks after things like making sure the requirements are there and having a test if the requirements are good enough. Making sure the design's there and as needed, making sure the interface definition is there as needed. Once it's all developed as they think it is developed, and said, well, okay, development's complete, you'll see the asset, in this case the service, be pushed over into the first instance of Policy Manager. In this case, it's our Development Policy Manager. Now, having said that, the way you should look at what happens between Portfolio Manager and Lifecycle Manager is that while those workflows are determined, they can be determined by any customer that purchases the products, and we can tailor it as they fit. What they should be looking at is two things around the workflow. One is that it's around determining what role or what person in what role needs to have what information at what stage to determine whether that asset needs to go to move forward to the next stage. That's principally it. That's principally it around the workflow and the definitions of workflow that's in Portfolio Manager and in Lifecycle Manager. So it's extremely lightweight. It's not heavyweight. It's not in any way prescriptive about how you must do things, even though it tracks an organisation's flow and process. It's about just doing that, tracking things to make sure that a decision is made and it's tracked that the decision is made. And the information there is there so that the decision can be made properly. So within Portfolio Manager, you're having steps around the decisions being made properly because all the information's there at the right stage by the right people. Around planning, we have this service ready to go in to be built. Around Lifecycle Manager, it's the same thing. But is that do we have all the metadata that's associated with this service being built up and the service itself being built up so it's ready to be tested? Now, that's one view, and it's an important view, and it's the mainstream view of what these products do. The other thing to be very, very cognizant of is that what you're actually doing when you're flowing through the different stages in Portfolio Manager and Lifecycle Manager is you're actually building up metadata that's important, not only for the decision-making process, but also going back and looking at history to say, what is this thing that was built? Where was it built? How was it built? Who built it? And how deeply was things flawed out? Well, that's all part of that metadata that's captured and kept for time immemorial, really. So the other part to look at is that the process is actually building up the metadata that's needed for an organisation over time to go back into Portfolio Manager and do the analysis again against new services to say, well, is this thing actually new, or is it just an extension of an existing asset? And how much or how hard it is to extend that existing asset as opposed to building something up new. And that's where you get the versioning aspects of it. None of that can happen unless you build up that proper metadata through your life cycle anyway. So the point I'm making here is that, yes, the process about decision-making and pushing things off dynamically up through its life cycle is important. But what else is important is you must be collecting enough data so that you can help yourself make decisions when you start off in the future about looking at new assets to be built. Which brings me to another point, and that is in our organisation, we principally look at Lifecycle Manager as being the repository, the enterprise repository within an organisation. And that's the way we sell it, and that's the way we do it. And it's principally based on that dynamic view or process view of the world. But it wouldn't take much with a few tweaks, and the customer deems it wants to have a lot of that information about, and it's just about state, feeding back into Portfolio Manager. So whenever you go into Portfolio Manager, you have a look at an asset, you see the state. That state will determine whether it links you over into a different phase inside Lifecycle Manager, or links it over to your Dev Policy Manager, or your Test Policy Manager, or your QA, Staging, Production Policy Manager, because its state's kept in Portfolio Manager. If you do that, then what actually happens is Portfolio Manager becomes your repository, your enterprise repository, not Lifecycle Manager. And instead of having two places to go, because you're splitting up over process, you go to one place because you have a facet that looks at the static view or the long-term lifecycle view with that information in one place, which is Portfolio Manager. So as you build up these products and move forward with these products, things can become quite elaborate and powerful as how you build these things, because the way that the process is built up is all driven by XML and quite easily changed. So having said that, what we're going to do with this demonstration then is to just have a look and build something up and decide something out of Portfolio Manager, push it across, as I said before, into Lifecycle Manager, into Dev, and then into Policy Manager. Now the scenario is this one here, where we've got this virtual organisation, this mythical organisation, Acme Corp if you want, that has an order process and a fulfillment process already in place. But they've had to just replace out their delivery services and delivery system with a new ERP system. Now, because of that, they have to go through this decision-making process of, do we have something that we could extend, or is that the existing one that we've replaced just not good enough? Because we bought the ERP because it's got new functionality in it that the old system didn't have. So do we produce a new version, or do we then decide to create a new version or decide to extend an older version. They also didn't have to decide how important it is based on the other requirements and the other priorities they have in the organisation. And then finally put a priority to it. And then finally they'll decide to have it built because the project comes up, and you'll see it come out of the planning processes, that is out of Portfolio Manager, and pop into Lifecycle Manager. So that's what's happening, and of course it goes through Lifecycle Manager, and you'll see it then appear into Portfolio Manager. We'll append some policies. Well, those policies will be appended automatically because we'll show you how that's done because of categorization set up in Lifecycle Manager. And then we'll run the actual system, and you'll see it working. And you'll see the results of that through different monitoring processes and policies that we have in place, and you'll see the results of the security that we put in place. Now, it's important to note at this point here that none of these services that are in place that you see here and be part of the solution and demonstration have any logging involved, have any security involved. So one of the things that the organisation decided to do is bring in a runtime governance solution like ours, well, exactly ours, to implement that. So you'll see how we do that. And that comes to this next slide, which needs a lot of explaining because it looks quite busy, but it does show everything we need to understand about what's involved in this demonstration. So going forward then, what we actually have is you'll have, number one, you'll have the application running off a browser, calls a servlet that's actually running in Tomcat, and that servlet has been bound to a delegate. So we have things intermediaries in SOA software of agents, and which are basically an in-container last mile intermediary, a network director, which is basically on the network proxied intermediary, and a delegate. Now, a delegate is the intermediary for a consumer, whereas an agent and network director are intermediaries for the provider, the service provider. So, and unlike with the agent and a network director, where you basically just set them up and have them installed inside the container or work by themselves, and there's no actual impact to the installation of the services. With the delegate, you have to actually bind that and compile that and link that into the service itself or the consumer itself. So we've got a delegate. So this picture, although we've got one delegate here, really should be a little box inside every one of these services that we have here. But it just didn't make sense to be too complicated to do that. So what happens is we've got a delegate inside the servlet. So when the browser calls the servlet, the delegate gets invoked. It sees that it has to intercept this call. And what it does, though, is because it knows that it's got to intercept this call and pass it on to a network director, it can interrogate the network director and see what policies are in place in the network director and what policies are in place in total for that service, and go and implement the client-side functionality inside the call to meet the requirements of the network director and agent policies. In this case, it's going to not do anything about network director. My mistake. It's going to insert a whole stack of WS security headers in the call, because what's in the network director is a number of aggregated policies around authentication with a WS security username token that's been signed and encrypted, and then authorization around the SAML assertion that's needed from a third party. So that all that information gets inserted automatically by the delegate. There's no code that's been put into the services, so that ND can interpret that and make a decision on whether that works or not. Then what happens, of course, is that it'll pass it on to, if it passes the security checks in the network director, it'll pass it down to what it thinks is down to the actual service that's been called, but the agent gets involved, and the agent is a filter that gets involved before the actual service implementation. And what we see in the agent is we'll have a logging policy here. So we'll see the calls logged out of network director and of course logged in an agent. So you'll see two logging aspects that are happening, and you'll see the tracking of all this moving forward inside the monitoring. Now, all that happens, like I said before, because there's been no code inserted in any of these. So we get security out of the box, and we get monitoring out of the box. And that happens because the way we set up our delegates and agents and network director. Which brings me to a very powerful point about if you've got the right products in place around runtime governance. Runtime governance is about taking out all the non-functional code that's been put into a service to meet the non-functional requirements that might be placed on the service. That is things like resilience, availability, performance tracking, and throttling, based on those things, monitoring and security. So the fact that you, instead of putting inside those agents, a call to an API call to SiteMinder, an API call to AD through a framework, and if those frameworks change because the corporation decides to go to a different vendor for your security mechanisms, then you're going to have to spend 6 months or even 12 months going and reconciling all your services in the code. What you do with non-functional requirements inside runtime governance is just change the policy. So against every service, not even through any code changes, but the policy in development, you change it, test it. If it works the way you want to do, you push it through to test. You push it through the QA, you push it through the staging, you push it through the prod. So in a matter of days or weeks, you've got this change in place instead of 6 months to 12 months. The same with logging, and we're saying with any RS aspects. So runtime governance releases or removes the burden of developers to concentrate on non-functional aspects of the services and just concentrate on functional aspects of the service. And that's what this demonstration shows as well. So usually I ask the class if there's any, or the audience if there's any concerns or questions about this diagram, because, and usually you get a lot of questions. A lot of it about the delegate, some about the agent, a difference between the agent and the network director and how you do things. The thing about the network director and why it's not an either-or situation between your network director and an agent is the network director looks after policies that make sense off the box. That is, things like failover routing and content-based routing, where you want to route to anything to do with routing, basically, whether you want to route to a different server for different reasons. So those reasons should be purely operational or non-functional. It shouldn't be, well, I know that this type of customer or this role in this application is a high-valued role, so I'm going to do something else and change the interpretation of that. That's functionalization of the code, and it's something that an ESB should look after, not a network director. But if it's things like, for this consumer, because I've identified a consumer in the contract, I know that this consumer has got a high-value gold contract, then I'll route it over to a number of servers over here, a cluster of servers that I know have higher speed because of that high-value gold contract. And that's purely operational, because that's all about improving performance and non-functional aspects of the things. So that's where it gets involved. So that's why a network director is good at doing things like that, whereas the agent, because it's on the box and it can't be intercepted before it calls the code that's inside the actual implementation of a service, the agents are good for last mile aspects of it. This logging's one thing of it, but the most obvious point about that is it's good for last mile security. So you can't get any interceptions across the network hop, or replays across the network hop, or man-in-the-middle attacks across the network hop that you can be from an ND to an agent, an ND to a service, but you can't have that inside an agent, which doesn't mean you should have an agent and nothing else, or it doesn't mean you have a network director and nothing else. Most customers start off with the network director because it's easy to understand and it's cheaper to implement. But then over time, they start to get mature and understand the value of an agent and start putting some of those in place as well. And some of the customers, like we have at the moment, want delegates in place because they see the value in doing that and having to remove code about, on the consumer side, about putting things in there to look after non-functional aspects of it. So that's where we're sitting at with this topology and going forward. So without any further ado, I suppose, we'll get on to actual running through the demonstration. So what we'll start off with logging into Portfolio Manager. So Ryan, at any time, or Brian, or anyone that's on the call, if you want to ask questions, please do, because they become valid if anything that I've been saying and doesn't make any sense or anything for you. So we're at Portfolio Manager here. And now Portfolio Manager and Lifecycle Manager, I should point out what this library thing is up here. Well, I've got this drop-down box for libraries. There's only one library at the moment, but why you have a drop-down box of libraries. The best way to envision this, or try to get an analogy for it, is to look at Portfolio Manager / Repository Manager as like a database management system, where a database management system can have many databases inside it, and those databases have entirely different functionalities between themselves. So a library is like a database, and Portfolio Manager or Lifecycle Manager is like the database management system. So you can have, and you can set up many libraries inside your repository. And why you might want to do that? Because you might have a very, very stovepipe organization that wants its own data and looks after its own data, but you don't want to have to put in a different implementation of Portfolio Manager or Repository Manager. So you just start up a different library, and the user is then the users are defined per library, and can log in to those libraries only as they're defined. And they might, even though user A might be defined in library 1 and 2, they might have different roles in library 1 as library 2, because it's all set up per library, as you would expect per database in a database management system. So that's what we're looking at is how a library is set up. Now, usually, most customers have a single library to work off, because it makes sense. It's their enterprise data they're talking about, enterprise services they're managing. So they'll come off of a single library. So that's what we have in this demonstration as well. So we're actually logging in as a person called Anne Payne, and happens to be a project manager. And then is the project manager of this project to get the ERP service built for the supply chain management system to replace it. So what she does is because she's a project manager, she has a certain view of the world. She looks at the asset tree, and the asset tree should be starting to build out sooner or later. And she says, okay, I want to see what services we have here. And you can see we've got the services split up as per their state or their phase in the planning process. So you have things that are proposed, things that are prioritized and identified. These are not in any particular order, but this is alphabetical order. Deprecated, deployed, and allocated. Okay, so obviously she's looking at and seeing if anything's deployed. And there's a shipping status, but there's no on the shipping method, many shipping methods. So we could have a look at that one. Okay, and she's had a look at this one. She's realised that this is the old one that's been replaced, and she knows about this old one. And if she wanted to, she can go over and have a look at the repository manager. And have a look at the different, so look at the requirements, and look at the design definition, and look at the interface, and work out what's involved in this. But she knows all about this one and knows that it's totally unsuitable for the needs. So she halts back and looks for anything else. So she looks at something that might be proposed. No, there's nothing in the proposed or identified. So she's going back down the tree and see if there's something planned that might be coming up, and there's nothing planned, so she decides, okay, I need to build a new one. Now, obviously, what's going to go on inside a real organisation is that there might be one person, that might be just Anne Payne again, that might be the representative for a steering committee or a group or a COE that has to go and do some analysis and drilling down inside the corporate repository to find out what's there and come back with candidates that might be needed online, that works through with the working committee to decide whether they're going to go forward or not as putting a new version out of a service or create a new one. So it's not going to be one person going off and doing this exact same process. But the point being made here is that even though it's not the one person going off and doing this one process, and there's going to be lots more people involved, and it could be involved in different ways, the checks are the same. The checks with the same roles and looking at the same information is the same regardless of what the actual process is. And that's what we're talking about, the difference between what we do with our design time tools as opposed to some other companies and organizations and our competitors do, is that we provide a check and balance with a role, with the information at a point in time. And that's what we're doing. And what happens behind that is up to the customer to work out it's best for their needs themselves in doing that. So having said that, we'll go back and we'll create an asset. You see, we've got a service. We've got service or knowledge at this point in time because it's the default workflow. And we're saying service identified, or we could say it's a new version of a service, but we're identifying a totally new service. We'll give it a name. You see, I've done this before. Give it a version. Now, that's all we have that's required. You see that the hint is given here on the form that this is all required. And the form itself and the validations that occur within the fields in the form and the validations that occur between the transition between the forms are all driven by XML. So everything's configurable as to how and what you see within the fields, form, and validations that occur. But this has been the out-of-the-box version. We'll take it as is. And we see we've created it and we're going still in the service identified state, but it says in order for this to be able to go forward and be submitted to go to the next phase, you need to put some more information down here. So we've got a classifier, which is classifiers are, in all intents and purposes, metadata around what we're building up as the asset. So in this case, it says, well, we need a value for the primary contact. And what we do is, of course, this is going to be a search on the customer's identity management system. In this case, it's Open LDAP, and so it's an LDAP repository, but it can be a number of different other leading repositories of information. So we type in, you can put in the full last name, or you can put in an asterisk. So we can put in Payne with a star, and bring back anything that matches that. And of course, there's only one, so it's Payne. So you can match. You can do some searching and search criteria on it if you wanted to. We'll pick up Payne, and that's all we need to provide. Oh, sorry, we need to provide now. Herein is a good point that we made as well. This is a categorization around the business domain. That is that it's a generalized one that this organisations decide to put in. So they've got their own and they're saying, okay, well, it's an order and it only goes to 2 levels, and we talk about we've only got one thing under order maintenance. And they've made this requirement mandatory because they want to be able to say, going forward, when you do searches, there needs to be some information categories to do searches on. But out of the box, we provide another categorization or taxonomy from an organization called APQC, which is a standards non-profit body in the US that looks after defining a generic categorization or taxonomy around what a business has. You can, if you wanted to, opt to make this one mandatory, or as in the case of one of our clients, a couple of our clients actually, they've got their own taxonomy that describes their business and their business layers and the business divisions and how it's all planned out and delivered. So they put that in around this stuff, and it could be as many levels deep as they require, and they've made that a requirement. But in case, let's say, we'll choose deliver products, and we'll choose produce and manufacture, or how about deliver service? And we'll provide service to a customer, and we're going to manage order fulfillment, which is what we're actually doing. So you can see by using the default set of APQC, we actually get a quite good fit about what we're talking about here. Is this what this service is about? So again, this is about providing data, metadata, around the asset that helps you in the future have understand what this thing is and what this thing was built for. So we'll save that. And we're ready to, you see, we've all got green ticks, so we're ready to send this. Now, the difference between a classifier, like I said, which is metadata, pure metadata that you put into forms, and artifacts, that artifacts tend to be externally housed and more complex pieces of metadata. They tend to be, for want of a better word, documents that you might attach to things. And at this point of stage, we don't need any artifacts attached to the service, nor do we need any relationships, although we'll show how they format later. So we'll submit this. In submitting it, what we're actually saying is, I'm going to try to push this forward to the next phase in the process, but the next phase is going to be policed by someone that's going to make a decision whether to accept it or reject it based on the information that's been collected, and the information is collected as per what the company needs. Now, because this is the default workflow, we actually don't have anything between going from an identified state to a proposed state. So we'll just submit it again. And you notice it's locked by AMPAIN. So and can't do anything about this. And we now know that we have to, this is before it goes to the next stage, we have to go and either accept or reject this proposal at the next stage. Now, usually what happens in this case is there's an email being sent off to the role or people that occupy that role for the next stage to say that you've got something in your inbox that in the repository that needs you to have a look at and make a determination whether you're going to accept it or reject it. But we happen to know who this person is for the demonstration, so it's B. Johnson. Sorry. And you see B. Johnson has a pending request. Let me have a look at the details of that. You see that the required role to accept the pending request is a product manager. That is, the product manager is the person that looks after a segment of the business, and they've had a look at this and said, well, this has been proposed to go forward as the service is going to replace that part of the business. Based on what you see here, do you either accept it or reject it? There's not a great deal of information here, and obviously what would happen behind the scenes again is that there'd be discussions with the product manager, with the project, and with the design team about what goes forward with the architects, with senior management, and decide whether they want this or not. But this person comes in and makes that decision finally before it moves forward. Brian's going to accept the proposed service, and we'll get an email saying that it's been accepted. So she'll log back in. Have a look at the assets and projects. It's no longer locked, and it's in proposed planning state. But before it can go to a prioritised planning state, there's other things that need to be added to this service because another decision needs to be made. And more information needs to be gathered before that decision be made properly. So in this case, we need to know what's the business value. This is obviously a business value high. Initiative type, so we can choose its common services. It's a master service. And yes, we're part of application portfolio rationalization because it's an ERP service. So again, any of these types or categorizations can be added, changed, modified as the customer needs. So it's definitely strategic, definitely. So we're just filling out information that we know is required. And let's say it's an enterprise. Now, I've chosen owned up here. Now, this is an interesting decision made, but based on the value here, what's going to happen is that I'll accept this, and when I get all the green lights and the ticks involved here, everything will look fine, but I'll get an error thrown up to me because on the transition between going to be proposed into prioritised, there is another validation that occurs on the transition. And the validation is based on the fact that if this was owned, then some other pieces of information is needed. But if we said it was lease free or per operation, then we won't need that information. And what we're saying here is because it's owned, we need to provide the project name that we think is going to take over this project because it's internal. So we have to know that this thing's coming up. So you'll see that happening. So we'll say this. I missed one. Service type required. Okay, so we're all agreeing. Now when I submit this, we get told we're missing a classifier because the own common services must specify an originating project. That is, who's going to own this service. Only because we chose owned in that field down there. If we had chosen anything else, this would have passed. So we'll just put in supply chain management. And now if we submit it, it'll be accepted. So you can see here you've got many ways to do validation and many ways to dynamicize a process and dynamicize, if that's just a word, the decisions and how you can put more logic involved in the process going forward. Again, where change is submitted and we know it's locked. So again, there will be a notification going out, and this time it will be to a portfolio manager role, I suspect, but this is a yes. So again, it's any person that's in that role will get the notification that they need to have a look at this and do something about this. It'll be approved. Joanna get told it's been approved. Should look back in. Get back to her service in the list. And again, before it can go to allocate it, so we've prioritised this. We've put it in a list of how important this is. But before we can say, well, we know we have a project that's going to build and look after these things, we have to add some more information before management can decide, well, yes, that project can build this, and it is within what we require. So first thing we think is, well, we need to understand what the cost is going to be. So we think it's about 20,000. And we need to understand how long it's going to take to build. So we'll say, let's make it a week. It's going to take a week. Spend $20,000. We're going to have an army looking after this. And now we're going to have to specify the owning development group. Now, what's happening here is that there's a query now going over to the Lifecycle Manager. And all the projects defined in Lifecycle Manager are going to be brought back into the list here. So because we're saying we're now ready to build this, and we're now ready to build this and put this over to Lifecycle Manager, A, we need a home for it to go to in Lifecycle Manager, and B, we actually need a real project. And the real projects are defined in Lifecycle Manager. So we're going to, and through integration, we have linked over and gotten the information out of the Lifecycle Manager repository, and we've chosen the supply chain management project. So everything should be ready to go. Now, before we go and progress with the next approval, I just wanted to prove that there's nothing in here, nothing in my sleeve, nothing in here that resembles the ERP service yet. And this is in Lifecycle Manager, what's called Repository Manager here. It's had a name change. So we can have a look at that after we do a submission and approval. Yes, and another trap. down here, what we need to do, of course, in this organisation is said, well, we're building a service. This service must have at least have a consumer, must be at least being built in the project, must and quite possibly have been aggregated or have a relationship with another service. So we're going to say it depends on, at least have one depends on asset we're talking about here, and it really does depend on the fulfillment service, because the fulfillment service calls the ERP service. Or it could be the other way around. The fulfillment service depends on the ERP, but we're talking about that as the relationship. Again, you can build up as many of these as possible because it helps understanding in the future about what this thing is and what the relationships are. And then finally, of course, in any impact analysis that might happen when anything gets changed. So we'll save that. Submit it. Then we need to do an approval because it's gone off and told the program manager, which happens to be the person that's going to be responsible for building this thing. Well, you've been notified that you're actually going to build a service. Do you want to build that or not? Again, meetings would have been had, decisions would have been made. The person comes along here, can drill down into anything that's occurred to get information about what they want to do and decide whether they will accept that, because there's enough information there for him to understand what it's going to do, and within the estimates and the budget that he's been given, whether he can do it or not, or she can do it or not, in which case its approval's been made. Now, if we come back over into Repository Manager and have a look at the assets in progress. Maybe I spoke too soon. Maybe I didn't wait long enough. Let me make sure. Yep, the ERP service is now allocated. So I'm going to log back into Repository Manager. We just didn't wait long enough. And here it is. It's appeared now into Repository Manager / Lifecycle Manager. So what's happened here is it's been given to the project, and the project's now using the Lifecycle design time, build time governance process to manage the delivery of the service going forward. Now, unlike with Portfolio Manager, where we had different roles and I logged in with different users under those different roles, what I'm going to do here is just use the one user. You'll see the steps progress, but you don't need to go through and be tired and taking a longer bit of time about logging in, logging out. So we're using a person called Alex, which happens to be the ACE, which is the Asset Capture Engineer, which is a person that really has a lot of power as far as doing anything around the service inside Lifecycle Manager going forward. So we just edit this. In the first stage we have to finish requirements complete stage, and of course now we start to see artifacts coming up. You can bet your socks that the first artifact it's going to require is actually the requirements document. So in this case it's a file. You could have a URL because it's over in a different content management system somewhere, or you can just put a description down. But obviously we're going to choose a file. So we'll go over and we'll pick up the file. And we put this in place. Now you notice all that we've done here, all that we can do really, is check that our file has been added to it. It's not Lifecycle Manager's place to have a look at that file and try to interpret whether the file is a good requirements document or not. That's why you have different people in different roles at the different phase points in the process to do. It's their job to make sure that they're happy with the artifacts that have been allocated and the classifiers that have been put in place and the information that's there to make a decision whether they want to accept or reject it. For instance, when this goes forward, the requirements document mightn't be complete. It mightn't be detailed enough. It mightn't have a good enough coverage of all the requirements. So it will be rejected and come back to this one stage again to have that filled out again. Now, obviously, there's communication behind the scenes because it can't be communicated here. Although when you reject it, you can put a comment in about why it's rejected. Of course, now we need to add some information here, and because we're now building up the actual artifact, it's asking us for a message protocol. So in this case, we're going to make it SOAP, and let's go over HTTP rather than HTTPS. You can have JSON in here and over HTTP, or XML over HTTP to indicate it's RESTful, or you can have REST JSON, REST XML over HTTP. You can put other protocols here as needed, as supported by your services as one, or configured by XML. So we accept that. We're ready for things moving forward. We submit it. Can put a note as to why you're doing this and what you wanted in place. So we just actually apply the filter again because that block will come off. Now we've gone to requirements complete, but before we can go to design complete stage, it's wanting us more information. And what this particular organization has said is that when you're going through the design, because we've got runtime governance in place, we want you in the design to know what policies and what contracts you have, well, in this particular case, just policies, that you're going to have against this service or attached to this service to meet the non-functional requirements that already were built up in the requirements and you're designing for, so that the runtime governance system can apply those policies automatically. So instead of waiting until you get there and making a decision, they're saying you should know what your non-functional requirements are. Therefore, you should know what policies you need to put in place. And if you haven't got a policy that's needed to put in place, you should build one and put it in place and define the relationship and do that. So that's what this relationship is all about. And that's what we're seeing more and more of our customers doing with Lifecycle Manager. And you'll see how magically that works when we get into the first instance of Policy Manager. So in this case, we're going to choose this policy set. Now, this policy set has a number of different policies. One is it's got a diagnostic auditing policy. That is, it logs everything about the request and everything about response. But you'll see down here it's got, well, it's going to check the consumer credentials because it's going to be made by a WS username token policy. And we're going to secure those or encrypt those by this WS security crypto policy. And then we're going to, on the end user credentials, look at those through this, again, which happens to be an aggregate policy when it gets put in place, the SAML security policy. So you can see this aggregated up, it's built up. And again, these were defined. If you have a look at the asset tree here, we have a technical policy set, which we just chose, which was this one. And it's made up of technical policies, which we can see here, which are here. You can see WS Security. Well, actually, it's made up of that one. That's made up of these ones again. So it's a policy set within the policy set, or a policy set made up of one policy that's aggregated. But you can see here, when we have a look at that policy and policy set, you can see what other services are using that already. So you can see the impact analysis that's occurred here around that. So just going back. So we have here, so we've chosen this policy set to be bound to this service. So this is going to end up with additional metadata in the relationship that will be pushed across to policy manager when it's promoted going forward. Now, out of the box in Lifecycle Manager, there's two stages where the actual service gets pushed across into the first policy manager that's integrated with Lifecycle Manager. At the end of design complete, when it's been accepted, and at the end of development complete, when it's been accepted. The reason for this is that some organizations will say that when the design's complete, I'll start the unit test, and if I'm going to start the unit test, I want that implementation inside our runtime governance, so I can start unit testing those policies as well, especially if it's a new policy. But some organizations say, no, I only want to have that definition go across into my runtime governance environment when development's complete. So that's why in the default organization, and the default, workflow inside Lifecycle Manager, it's at two places. So before we do this one, we'll go over to our development policy manager. We'll have it drill down into enterprise services, eCorp enterprise services, supply chain management, and the services and supply chain management. And you see we have no ERP service here at all. So let's go back and let's submit this. Oh, what it's told me is that, well, again, on transition, you haven't provided us with a service definition. So where's the interface definition? So we need to pick up the WSDL and add it here. So we'll save it. Now this could have been done as part of the need at this point in time within the validation of the form. But in this case, for development purposes and demonstration purposes, I should say, we're showing how it picks up on the transition, just like when we had the fact that it was owned, an owned service before inside Portfolio Manager. And we'll submit this. Okay. So we're now still at design complete, which is a bit strange. Let me hop out. Right, we're just a little bit too quick. Now we're transitioning into development complete. But before we do that, we'll come over to here. We'll refresh the services found inside supply chain management, and here we have our ERP service. So our physical service has been pushed across into policy manager, ready to be used. And you see we've got some special categories here that we'll talk about in the next step going forward about what this means and how this applies to policy attachment. Firstly, I want to go back though before we finish off this session and show you what would happen if, now, in order to go to development complete, we still have to fill something out. So what this organisation is saying here is that, well, you said it was going to cost $20,000 to build when you made an estimate of this. What did it actually cost? So they're tracking return on investment, ROI on services. So they're looking at actually cost services to try to A, improve their estimation model, but B, work out how much a service did cost, aggregated services do cost, so they can charge for those services, their consumers going forward as well. And we have a model that can be used and attached to Lifecycle Manager that helps with that ROI process. It's built from an academic out of the US, and we've licensed it and it's available to all our customers to use on this as well. So in this case, let's say it was 8,000. Yep. And before we go any further, it's saying, well, where's the user guide? Again, the company specifies that as a rule, so it's requiring that to be attached. Now, what we're also going to do before we do anything else, up in here in the message definition, I'm actually going to change it. And I'm going to choose a whistle that I know is an error. And I'll submit that. Now, as we submit it, that whistle is now being passed like it was before. And this is the difference between structured information that we can control around the service and unstructured information like requirements, documents, or user guides, or whatever, where we can't control, and the users involved in making sure they're valid for themselves. What we're actually, in this case, the whistle's been passed, and it says, well, there's a warning here. It says that you've actually got a namespace in this whistle that matches the namespace of another whistle of another service. Now, the common practice, the most accepted process, the way you do versioning around services is via namespace. That is, the domain or the owner of the service is part of the domain space with the service name, and then the major version is attached to that as well. So you'd have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, not minor version because it becomes far too unwieldy to manage. But the major version is attached to that. So what you're actually saying here is that if you've got the owner in the service name and the major version that looks exactly the same in this namespace for this namespace for this service as you've got for another service, you've actually got the same service. And we recommend that you have a look at that and do something about it. So we can trap these things for just validations. It happens as well. So we don't want to do that, obviously. We want to make sure it's the proper service with the proper namespace and proper version. So we'll go and pick up the right whistle that we had before. We submit this. And we now see where our development is complete. Of course, the asset's already over here. I have a look at it again. And it's ready to go. So normally, this is where I complete this section because it's a nice break between design time and runtime. And the next topic we'll go through and look at how the runtime works, what happens inside the development runtime version, policy manager, around policy attachment, and the importance of looking at the org structure in this organization tree and how that gets related back to Lifecycle Manager. So that concludes phase 1 or lesson 1 of the end-to-end demonstration.